Another fantastic day. The weather has changed. And not only that, but the waves have calmed when it comes to interest rates and mortgage loans and just the crazy stuff going on in the world today. And when it comes to mortgages, but we have our captain of our ship ready to tell us, hey, where are we headed next? What does the future look like? And what shores should we land on so we can make sure we, as people who need a loan for a home, are going to land on safe, solid ground. I know Plymouth Rock has already taken, but let's get him on the show and find out exactly what our next port of call is. Hey, Art, welcome.
Hi, Jeff. How are you?
Good. How's the captain today?
Well, I'm good. Of course, you're making me feel like, I used to be a boat owner for about most of my adult life. I had a sailboat, so I don't have it anymore. So you're making me feel like I wish I had it back. So.
Oh, geez. I think today it's about 12 to 15 knots. It'd be good for sailing, wouldn't it?
Perfect.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Not too crazy.
Yeah, well, you want a pretty good breeze, but you don't want force 5. Let's put it that way.
Hey, I know a lot of things have been going on. We finally got, as you talked last week a little bit, that the Fed had taken their foot off the "I'm going to continue to raise the rates" kind of thing. I'll let you get into more of that, but it almost feels like, you know what? When somebody gives you good news, all of a sudden your breathing is going from into your throat, into your belly, and all of a sudden my muscles are a little bit relaxed. Am I too anxious, or is it too early, or what do you think?
It might be a little early, particularly based on what happened today in the bond market, which I'll get into in a second. So I'll touch on that.
Well, hey, those of you that are watching us live, I'll be dipping out of here and answering questions on the comments, or if you put comments in there, we'll send them over to Art and he'll answer those. If you're watching this on a recorded version, please put your comments in the question, whether it's on Facebook or YouTube. And again, Art will address those for you. You can always reach him at 760-883-5700 for more information. With that, I'm going to bow out, Art, and I'm going to turn this over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. Hello, everyone. Art Alvarez at Mortgage Works, where we do have the answers around the house. Welcome to this week's Mortgage Minute. As you probably know by now, one of the first things I like to do is get into what's going on in the bond market and the interest rate markets. So let's go ahead and start with that as usual. There's our rate grid. It's been updated as of today to reflect where rates are at. And I'll say again that contrary to the media suggesting that rates were in the 8s, we have not been, and in fact, there has been some more recent improvement in bond yields that has improved rates a little bit, at least up until today. In fact, Jeff will pull up here a 5-day chart of the 10-year bond yield, and you're going to see that 462. That's actually as a result of the movement in the bond yield today, and you can see that on the right side of the screen, that little uptick on the graph. After dipping down earlier in the week. And it's kind of interesting what's going on there. Interesting in the sense that all week, you start to see a lot of news headlines on the news feed about, I think I saw one that said, mortgage rates have plunged to a 16-month low and things like that. Well, not quite. And so what is going on here that caused this little uptick today after we had some pretty reassuring improvement in bond yields earlier in the week, even going back to late last week? Well, in terms of economic data points, it really wasn't much of that. I mean, the calendar this week was very, very light on economic data points. Very little in the sense of any data being released that's going to have a big effect on the market. But what was a big part of this week's calendar, economic calendar, is what I call on the graph here, Fed speak. And so what do I mean by that? Well, I always pull up the U.S. economic calendar every week on Monday to see what's coming up. And as I said, very light in terms of economic data points. But what was interesting is there was a listing day to day, Monday through Friday. I counted them all, a total of 10 different folks who are part of the Federal Reserve System, not just Chairman Powell, but several of the presidents of each of the Fed districts, the Fed banks. So there's a heavy calendar of all of those folks talking, giving speeches, being interviewed all through the week. And the messages there have been a little bit mixed. Some of them were, kind of commenting that things may be close to the end in terms of the Fed strategy to keep raising rates. Some were still holding out that we may have to do another one, maybe two increases in the near future. The market overall was reassured, which is why we saw that 10-year bond yield back off from almost 5% to, well, heck, yesterday, Wednesday, even Tuesday late afternoon, we were actually down to about 450 and even getting into the high 440s. But yet, you got to watch out with Fed speak, because that can change day to day based on the comments coming out of the Fed. So guess what happened today? Fed Chairman Powell gave a speech, and he kind of rattled the markets a little bit. And the reason he did that is because he basically declared, the Fed Chairman Powell is not confident that they've done enough to raise the Fed funds rate. So he put back on the table that a hint that there may be more to come in raising the Fed funds rate. So as a consequence, what happens? The bond yield, which was again hovering around that 450, has now backed up to around 462. So that's pretty much directly related to what Chairman Powell said today in a speech. So that's sort of taken a little bit of gas out of the improvement in bond yields and mortgage rates that we've seen. But I also want to remind you, heck, it was only about maybe 6 weeks ago, late September, the 10-year bond yield was right in the range of 4.5. So it's not like this new improvement is a plunge. We were already at this level about 6 weeks ago, and it, of course, ran up to almost 5 in the interim. The only data point which actually came out today that had any consequence was initial claims for unemployment benefit, projected to be 220,000, came in a little bit lower, 217,000. Of course, that causes the markets to think that the labor market's pretty strong. Tomorrow is consumer sentiment. That can sometimes move the market. So I think today in particular is a good example of that little note I have on the bottom of the screen where I say on financial markets, they respond with reptilian-like minds to stimuli. So today, the stimuli, Chairman Powell speaks. Market didn't like what he had to say. Market thought that we were pretty much over with raising the Fed funds rate. And now Fed Chairman Powell has put it back on the table that, nope, maybe they're not quite done and there could be another increase. The bet now is there could be an increase either December in their meeting or in January. All of that bet, it's about a 25% probability is what the markets are looking at right now. So that's where you're at on the markets. Yes, good news that mortgage rates, bond yields have improved a little bit. I think it's a little bit of an overstatement that mortgage rates are plunging. I mean, after all, we're still in the 7s. It wasn't that long ago we were in the 6s. And of course, I don't want to remind everybody in early 2023, we were actually in the high 5s. So again, good news, but guarded good news. And I think we're going to not see any real plunging that the market was expecting. So that's where we're at on the bond market and interest rate markets. So now we're going to actually jump right into our Q&A session. In particular, we're going to touch on something that I got exposed to this morning in a discussion with some folks in the industry. So I don't know if Jeff, or if you're going to come back on the show, and let's go ahead and talk about a couple of these questions.
Yeah, before we jump into that, I just want to ask a couple of questions. Because I'm one of those consumers that watch that news in the morning, or that the ticker that says, hey, yeah, the rates are plunging. I'm just curious, when those numbers on a treasury bill start dropping like they are, and you've talked about this a little bit before, but maybe in a little bit more specifics, what's that doing for HELOCs, for people who are saying, hey, let's take out some equity in our home for one purpose or another? Are we seeing those drop a little bit? Or they just been really stable and something we as homeowners with equity can move forward on? What's the deal?
Well, that's a very good question. And the short answer is stable. Remember that HELOCs, home equity line of credit, variable rate loan, the rate adjusts anytime the prime rate changes, generally speaking, because most HELOCs are tied to prime. Prime is directly tied to Fed funds. So whenever the Fed funds rate changes up or down, the prime rate's going to follow suit immediately, unlike a 30-year mortgage. 30-year mortgage, there's an indirect correlation. It's not direct like prime versus Fed funds. So what I would remind everyone is that there has not been an increase in the Fed funds rate since July. And I think that should be good news for anybody either who has a HELOC or who's contemplating one, because of the fact that it has been stable for we're going on 5 months, going into 6 months. And so as a consequence, HELOC rates have not gone up, unlike, 30-year long-term mortgages. So to me, if you're a homeowner, you got the equity, you haven't tapped into it yet, you're kind of still on the fence about getting a HELOC, I think the timing might be good, because even if the Fed raises the Fed funds rate another quarter, I don't see much beyond that. And as a consequence, later on in the future, I think we will see some improvement. And so in that respect, getting a HELOC now, probably good timing, because you've probably already seen the worst of it in terms of the Fed funds and prime going up. And so getting a HELOC now means in the future, the probabilities are you're going to get that loan now already at the peak rate it's going to be, and you got a much greater probability that the HELOC rate is going to come down the next couple of years.
Well, I think about a couple of weeks ago, you were talking about one of the strategies for somebody taking out a home equity line of credit is to, because of the stability you were talking about, and on the flip side of that, somebody who has maybe a lot of credit debt and it has gone up over 50% in that same period of time, in that 21+%. And, if you can replace that with what? High nines, 10%, isn't that a good strategy?
Very much so. I mean, it's on our rate grid on our website. For the right situation, you've got a lot of equity, good credit score. We can still do a HELOC at 9.5%.
Really
and
good.
So with that kind of rate on a HELOC, it's kind of a no-brainer if you've got a lot of credit card debt in the 21% average rate level, which is what they are. If you can take that debt and move it from the credit cards to a HELOC, you're going to cut your interest rate in half. Plus, of course, the fact, check with your tax advisor, you have the added benefit of probable deductibility of the interest costs, which of course credit cards don't provide.
Yeah, and I was just reading last week where credit card debt, we talked about the last time on the show, was 1.03 trillion, is now 1.08 trillion, and people are falling more and more behind. So this would probably be a good time to reconsider and say, hey, instead of trying to meet those minimum payments, get a hold of Art. His number is 760-883-5700, and he can help talk you through some of this stuff to see if you are a candidate for that. Obviously, you have to be a homeowner with some equity. But, what were you saying? The average person has over a couple $100,000 equity in their home right now because of the way the market has moved as far as values.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, home equity, or equity in homes in general, and this, of course, nationwide, is very, very high right now. So there's lots of money that could be tapped there. But a lot of homeowners are still nervous about rates, worried that the Fed's going to keep going. So some resistance to a HELOC because of that concern that it's a variable rate loan and could continue to go up. I think while I oftentimes, most of the time, will say don't try to time the market, I will qualify that by saying right now for a HELOC, I think the timing might be pretty good.
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, first of all, Art, thanks for talking about that. It was just something that was a bit of a burning question that I wanted to have answered from one of our viewers that I wanted to put out there. But this other piece is interesting. You are very active in the community, and as we've talked about before, I mean, you've been doing this for over 4 decades, and you know everybody knows you. But just recently, as of this morning, you were in a meeting this morning. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that, especially when it talks about, or when they talk about, hey, what part of the market is moving and why is that? And is that a clue for other parts that may be struggling?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm very involved with local industry events, Association of Realtors and Builders Association and so forth. And I was at a meeting this morning with the local real estate association. And we were actually talking, myself and another originator, friendly competitor. In fact, I even get invited to their holiday party every year. But her and I were talking to a title rep with a major title company. And we were just talking about, what's going on in the business right now. How is business in terms of, activity? And it was interesting. This title rep commented that, things are still kind of slow. Of course, refinance activity, very, very slow. Because of where rates are at. But even in the resale markets, certainly activity is not where it was before. And we've already talked about on this program how existing home sales have been soft and have declined somewhat over what they were. But what was interesting is she went on to tell us both that the part of their company that was pretty much doing very well was their builder division. And she goes on to describe that the reason for that is because in the builder division, the builders they work with are good at using financing incentives. She particularly and specifically mentioned interest rate buy downs she believed, and I agree with her, as a factor that underscores why the new home market, even here locally in the Coachella Valley, is doing relatively well or doing better than existing home sales. And she touches on what I've been harping about for quite a while now. Builders are using financing to spur some of those sales. And to me, it was just underscored that message that I think in the resale markets, there's a little bit of a lack of focusing on financing, either when you're listing a home with the seller, you're getting a listing from a seller, or representing a buyer. For example, when a realtor is talking to a seller and trying to get that listing, it's my belief, and I think it was a little bit underscored this morning in this conversation, that there's not a lot of time spent talking about as they decide between the seller and the listing agent what they're going to list the property for, what price they're going to list at. They don't really talk about, I don't believe, whether or not they should contemplate financing as a parameter to consider and maybe settle on that final list price to take into account the possibility, or maybe even, I think they should more directly, a strategy to incorporate in that list price some amount of funds that would be made available as a concession to offer a financing incentive to a prospective buyer. And of course, the most obvious thing to do in a current high rate environment is to consider doing that, and right from the get-go, advertise that listing with some, financing incentive that will be compelling to a prospective home buyer. I mean, if, for example, if I'm a listing agent trying to get a listing from a seller, and we're talking about what do we need to list it for, we look at the comps, we try to figure out as best we can what the market is for that property, and let's say we decide it's $750,000. Well, I think what's lacking, and what I would do if I was selling real estate, not arranging loans, I'd be talking to that seller about, $750, we think that's a pretty good price, but maybe we ought to play the game that builders do. Instead of listing at $750, maybe we ought to list at $779. And in doing that, we'll put right in the listing, seller is willing to offer a concession to finance the cost of a temporary rate buy down, such as a 3-2-1, and advertise in that listing how much that could save, either in monthly payment or maybe just reference what the rate would be. I mean, for example, right now, market rate for a conforming loan, well, we're at about 7.125, 7.25 range. Well, consider if you were going to list a property and you've decided on your list price, it might make sense to pump up that list price a little bit to account for what the cost would be to, say, advertise a 3-2-1 buy down. So that way, what you're doing is right from day one, when you activate that listing, you're offering not 7.25. You're referencing the fact, hey, seller is willing to help you, the buyer, get a 4.25 rate first year. Well, on a price level that high, 750 or so, and let's say they're putting 20% down, the monthly payment benefit to the buyer with a 3-2-1 buy down is likely going to be over $1,000 a month. In the second year, it's going to be like probably $600 a month. And third year, probably $300 a month. Over a 3-year period, that's a substantial amount of savings to that buyer. And I think that kind of listing strategy would attract more buyers and probably get some, more of these homes sold. And I think in addition to that, you've got the same sort of situation happening when a realtor is working with a buyer, not a seller, with a buyer. Oftentimes they'll be out looking at homes. The buyer finds one that they're interested in. Maybe it's been on the market for a few weeks, maybe 30, 40 days. So the buyer, feeling like with high rates, they've got a little bit more leverage. I think the kind of knee-jerk reaction is, okay, I like that home at $750, but it's been on there on the MLS system for 35 days. So I think that means it's a little soft. They haven't had any price adjustment. So let's offer 710 instead of the list price of 750. Now, sure, that 710, that below list price, is going to help the buyer somewhat in a lower monthly payment. But remember, I always say it's about $1,000. Well, each $1,000 less loan amount is about $7 a month. So if you $40,000 below list, crude math would be 40,000 at $7 a month. You're going to save maybe $280 a month on a monthly payment. That's worth something, right? But consider, why not offer full price? But then ask for that concession amount. In fact, it doesn't have to be 40,000, probably a little less than that, for the cost of a 3-2-1 buy down. That way, as the buyer, you like that house, but you're also getting it at a price that, yes, it's closer to or at list, but you're getting those dollars in a different way. You're not getting them in a lower price. You're getting it in the form of a bunch of money, a basket of money that will then be used from the seller's proceeds to subsidize your rate on say, a 3-2-1 or maybe a 2-1 buy down. That is financially much more powerful, much more compelling to that buyer. They're going to save a great deal of money over that 3-year period. And as we keep talking about that 3-year period, realizing that it's a pretty good bet that rates are going to fall from where they're at now during that next 3-year period, that gives you that opportunity for that one-sided bet, as Warren Buffett calls it. And you can get a very below market monthly payment and rate initially. And you've got that 2 to 3 year period to keep an eye on the overall market. Rates fall. Then you have an opportunity to refinance and get rid of that 7.25 note rate, maybe get something at 6 or 5.5 or 5. And then that becomes really a win-win, because that way you've already got into home ownership. The prediction is when rates fall, home prices are going to go up. They're not going to drop a whole lot. So that way you get into home ownership now. You can ride the upward trend in terms of home appreciation, enjoy below market payments, and then have that refi opportunity. So I think that's something that I see that realtors, both when working with sellers and with buyers, don't really focus on, unlike home builders. And I think part of it has to do, I was talking to another agent today whose comment was, well, I don't get into the loan side. I mean, my job is to work with that buyer and help them find a house and make an offer. And yes, I got to rely on a realtor, I have to rely on a lender to get my buyer pre-qualified. But otherwise, the details of the financing, I don't generally get into. That's between my buyer and the lender they've chosen, who I may have referred them to, but still that's between them. My job is to sell them the house. I don't get too much involved in the financing side. I believe realtors need to rethink that. Home builders are their competition, and they need to look at what home builders are doing and take into account what that title rep told me this morning. Their sales are good. Their sales are up. Their sales now are about 30% of the market when they used to be like 10 or 15% of the market. And it's because builders understand financing, the critical part of finance, or the critical aspect of financing as it relates to getting more homes sold. I think realtors need to focus on that. So if you're listing a home, talk to somebody like me. You've settled on a potential price you're going to list for. Let me, take a stab at telling you what you can do in terms of some financing incentive to enhance the offer to the prospective buyer. Same thing on the buyer side. You got a home you're looking at, you want to make an offer, but you're thinking you want to just go under list. Check with me first. I can give you some numbers very quickly and give you another alternative to consider that could still help, motivate the seller to accept your offer, but at the same time, give the buyer a much better deal on the loan term. So I think that's something that is lacking. And one of the things I'm going to be trying to put together is I'm thinking about maybe doing some sort of seminar that could be available not just for buyers and sellers, but even realtors, to try to educate them on what kind of strategies can be pursued using financing to help everybody get some more homes sold. So that's kind of what we're going to be focusing on, and we'll have more information on in the near future. Jeff, back to you.
Art, it's interesting because I know somebody, if they've watched this program before, they say, why does Art keep talking about the 3-2-1 buy down? And the point is this is there's this rule of what I call 7-Eleven, and it's not something I've made up. It's behavioral. It says we need to spend about 7 hours with somebody or someone before we know, like, and trust them. And we might need to hear that message up to 11 times before it finally is like, oh, that's right. That's exactly what I need.
Right.
I personally am going through this with a different type of purchase, and I'm looking at it like many times. So I think it's one of those things that we really want to send this message home. And it seems to me like, the builders have left clues to why they're successful. And I think of the statement that says, sell the sizzle, not the steak. And I'm wondering if the builders, and you would know this best, are they selling the price of the home, or are they selling the rate that they can buy the home for?
I think it's the latter. It's kind of like buying a car. It's all about the payment, right?
Yeah.
So most builders, they set their prices, but they recognize, particularly in the environment we've had the last couple of years with rates going up, affordability is becoming more of an issue. And if it's not even affordability, just buyer resistance to these much higher rates and payments. Mortgage payments now are, almost double what they were in 2020 and 2021. Builders are very, very dialed into that, and they recognize that while they've got their prices and they're trying to sell those prices, they've got to give the buyer more incentive to accept that price by getting them access to better financing terms. And ultimately, what it boils down to is better monthly payment.
Yeah.
Builders just really, really are dialed into that. The resale markets even now, there's been a little bit more movement in that direction, but I think it's still kind of lacking. And I've kind of made it my mission to really, I talk about it all the time with anybody who will listen, especially if they sell homes, that they really need to look at that and get into a partnership, whether it doesn't have to be me. If you've got your other preferred lender, you got to collaborate more together and rely on us on the loan side and let us help you, show you ways you can sell that home or sell more homes if you pull in the financing as part of your strategy, whether you're representing a buyer or representing a seller.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And you almost see this, if a person went out and they looked at a new car lot and a used car lot, the used car lot representing, let's say, existing homes, they just have the price on the window. But if you go to the new car lot, it has the monthly payment on there, and they're selling a bunch of new cars. To
Right.
me, that's a clue. And I think what you're saying is the new home sellers are doing exactly the same thing. And we, as existing home sellers, real estate agents, buyers, sellers, could do the same thing. And let's advertise what our monthly payment is. Is there any resistance on that, or is there anything that we can't do if I'm selling my home and I advertise a payment because I'll be willing to buy the rate down?
Well, the only thing you have to watch out for, there are some regulatory issues in terms of quoting a specific payment or a specific rate, but there are ways you can, the verbiage you would put in your listing to at least make it pretty well known, pretty clear that you're offering some serious dollars to help subsidize the rate and the payment to the buyers. And we can help with that. So you don't want to necessarily just put in your listing, hey, buy my house, and then in the listing remarks, you're going to get a 4.25% interest rate. You got to be a little careful with that, but you can get that message across with a little bit different language. But again, I think that's something that most sellers just really don't focus on. Historically, it's always been over the years, sellers sort of have this attitude in the resale markets. It's like, buyer's loan, that's none of my business. I don't want to get involved in that. Buyer, where the buyer gets the loan, what kind of terms they get, that's up to them and whoever they find. I don't need to be involved in that. That's not what I want to do. I think they've got to rethink that in this particular interest rate environment, any high interest rate environment. Again, home builders, they can turn on a dime when they need to. The resale markets are like that, that big battleship that takes a long time to turn around, because it takes, like you said, they got to hear it about 10, 12 times. And then the light goes on finally. And then hopefully they'll start to, pursue those strategies and use them to get more homes sold.
Well, I'm excited about the opportunity. I really appreciate you not beating a dead horse, but beating the drum of this is an opportunity, folks. And
Right.
when you mention about having a seminar or a class for people, and you talk about the verbiage, is that something that you would teach both the real estate agents and maybe prospective buyer or sellers
Sure.
to properly set the language so they would
Sure.
stay in that regulatory
Yeah.
lane?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure.
Great, great.
Definitely part of what we would do. Yeah.
Well, Art, thank you again so much in really diving deep into this. I want to turn this back over to you now. I know we have last week's closing question
Right.
that you want to finish up with. So thank
Yeah.
you very much.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. Okay, folks, now we're going to go into our closing question from last week. And this is something that I think is a pretty interesting topic, something we run into from time to time. Here's the question. We're in escrow to purchase a home and the appraisal report came in low. Do we have to accept the report or do we have any recourse, such as requesting another appraisal? Well, I've got a few comments about that. First of all, one of the things I want to maybe defend appraisers a little bit, because when this happens, when an appraisal comes in low, there tends to be an immediate reaction that the appraiser doesn't know what he or she is doing, that they're wrong, that their opinion doesn't hold any water. Well, I want to let everyone know, understand that appraising property, it's a profession. And it's a very complex profession in the sense that you have to go through a lot of hours of training and education, even to get to the point of getting licensed to be an appraiser. I think a lot of folks underappreciate that. There's probably, an appraiser, once they've gotten through that certification education, they're a professional who are probably best suited to identify the value of a property. So I just want everyone to keep that in mind. I mentioned the psychology of a low appraisal. What I mean by that is over the years, one of the things I've always noticed that I think is a little bit interesting is that you've got a buyer seller, you've got an escrow going, the appraisal gets ordered and it comes in low. And one of the things I always see happening is, the buyer will be disappointed and will, ask about, well, can we get another appraisal or do we have to just accept this? And of course, my thinking has always been, well, if I'm a buyer and the appraisal comes in low, maybe that's a good thing, or at least it's good in the sense that maybe it's trying to tell me that the price I agreed to pay may be a little bit higher than it should be. Now, that's not to say that it still makes sense to do that. But from a psychology standpoint, I would suggest a buyer shouldn't just immediately decide that a low appraisal is a bad thing. And then they, on the buyer side, have to work real hard to get it up to a higher level, the price that they agreed to. So I just point that out because the first thing I would do as a buyer is first try to renegotiate the price and see if the seller will accept a lower price because the appraisal suggests the home's not worth what I agreed to pay for it. But that doesn't happen too much. And so oddly enough, buyers oftentimes are the ones who are most disappointed and want to take steps to try to get over that and still get the deal closed, either by getting the value raised or getting another appraisal. And by the way, getting another appraisal is usually not the best or the first course action to take because even if you have two appraisals, the lender is going to generally take the lower of the two. So what can you do? And I've done this several times. You can submit a rebuttal to the appraisal report. Now, what is a rebuttal? That's basically an appeal. And I usually will do this on a case of a low appraisal. And there's a couple of angles you can take in doing that. One is just check for basic data accuracy. Make sure that all the numbers in there are accurate, gross living area, room count, bedrooms, bathrooms, that kind of thing. Just making sure that there's not gross errors in the data in the report. So you always look at that first. But more often, it's about additional comps. And you can rebut an appraisal by providing additional comps. Usually, you can provide up to 3. Excuse me. And what I've listed there is some basic parameters that are used in the appraisal industry in general. Gross living area. That should generally be between 20 and 25% compared to the subject property. So in other words, if you've got a 1,000 square foot subject property, then the gross living area of any comps that you select should be somewhere in, say, the 1,250 on the high end, 750 square feet on the low end. Radius of 1 mile, that's the general parameter for appraisals. So you want to try to make sure that if you're going to provide additional comps, they're within that radius. They can be out farther, but then you have to justify why that's being used. And then the age of the closed comps generally should be within 6 months. Now, again, these are guidelines. You can go outside of those, but you have to justify the use of comps that go beyond these standards. And the one thing I will tell you is, don't forget that when it comes to comps, appraisers have access to all the data that's out there. So it's pretty unusual for an appraiser to miss a comp that would support that report that came in low. So we always try to look at that, but it's pretty rare that appraisers overlooked a comp that they should have used to support a higher value. And by the way, appraisers cannot overlook a comp that might hurt the report and go farther out to use a comp that would help the report. If, for example, the comp that would hurt is inside that radius of 1 mile and the comp they're trying to use is outside that radius, that's going to be a little bit tricky and it may not work. So I do this from time to time. The success rate on rebuttal is not particularly high. Again, appraisers are professionals. They have access to all the data. They've gone through a lot of training. So it's pretty difficult to get a rebuttal successfully done unless that appraiser is frankly maybe lacking a little bit of lacking in the way of competence and maybe just being a little bit sloppy in their data work and their comp search. The other thing I want to point out real quick, price per foot. A lot of folks out there think that value is determined by just calculating price per foot. Doesn't work that way. That's a fallacy. Price per foot is a result of an appraised value that's determined by using comps and making adjustments. So price per foot is not the determinant of value. Price per foot is the result of appraised value after taking into account comps and their features and making adjustments accordingly. And then the last thing, on appraisal reports, there is something called an SSR. That's a summary scoring report. It's kind of the, and these, by the way, come from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And it's kind of for an appraisal, sort of similar to the desktop underwriter or loan prospector that's used for the credit loan file where you get an approve eligible or an accept eligible based on the data in the loan application. This is a similar process for appraisal reports. So the SSRs basically grade the report based on using software. And there's either a point range or a certain collateral representation that will be reflected in these reports that will underscore whether or not this appraisal that was done is done adequately and meets all the criteria for arriving at a accurate determination of value. So answer is, if you have a low appraisal, best thing to do is try to do a rebuttal if you can. And we do that. It does work sometimes, not a high degree of success, but I would say probably in the range of maybe 10% of the time a rebuttal can work. But that's a better approach than trying to just get another appraisal. Because again, even if it came in higher, if that lender is presented with 2 appraisals, they're going to use the lower of the 2. So that's a good question, and that's how that works. I'll go now into next week's question, the closing question for next week. And I'm doing this sort of in recognition of this weekend is our Veterans Day on November 11th. So, of course, I want to thank all the veterans out there for your service. And I wanted to just highlight this question this week for veterans. Here's the question. What additional benefit does the VA loan program offer to disabled veterans? So next week, I'll discuss that in detail, where I'll provide you the answer, and it'll be on the house. Jeff, back to you.
Sorry, this is a live show, so I was responding. Oops. I said, sorry, this is a live show. So I was kind of responding to that emergency alert that just came in on our phones.
Yeah, my cell phone just went off. Yeah.
We've had some issues with the 911. This is in East Riverside County. It hit yesterday during dinner that I remember it popped on. Like everybody's phone went wild. Yeah. Yep. So the good news is it's only for emergencies.
Right.
You know, Art, I really appreciate all the stuff that you do. I really do. This is great information. And I just want to point out that the information, I want to bring this back up on here and just get to the end screen here. I'm a little bit troubled today because my computer went out minutes before the show started. So I had to rig up something. So I'm using a laptop and a couple of monitors. So I apologize.
Sure.
On the information here, you've got Art's information for his phone number is 760-883-5700 at his office. Of course, you can always reach him on his cell phone no matter where he is, what planet he's on. Yes, he does. He's thinking about going to Mars, folks.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he will get the loan set up for you. 714-612-9035. You can always go to the website and find a host of information there at mwloan.com. There's the rate information. There's also all kinds of calculators that help you. And if you're looking for sources of information, just go to his blog. There's a lot of information on there. And of course, you can always send an email at art@mwloan.com. Art, I really appreciate this. Has been really, really good information today. And I'm like you. I want to salute our veterans for all that they've done for our country and continue to do it. And I really appreciate the question. Any last thoughts before we wrap up today's show?
No, that's about it. Next week we're gonna, I think we're gonna have a guest, and we're gonna get into credit scores and talk about those and how they affect both the rate you can get on the loan, and more importantly, what steps a consumer, a borrower, can take to try to improve their score if it's a little bit lower than they'd like it to be. That can be important because part of what we'll talk about is how different score levels can have a pretty significant effect on what kind of rate you can get.
Also, if you said, hey, I heard Art talk about he may be doing a seminar coming up shortly on the whole idea of a temporary rate buy down, whether you're a seller, you're a buyer, or you're a real estate agent. Is the number at your office the best place to contact them, or for them to contact you, or an email? Art, what is the best way for that to happen?
Well, frankly, either one. You got the number there on the phone as well as the email. But yeah, whichever they prefer or more comfortable with, yeah, feel free to reach out, and we can certainly discuss it. So, there's the alert again.
There we go.
Yeah.
Keeping with the nautical theme, this has been a very smooth sail today. I appreciate that. Got a little salt in my face and the sea breeze. So have a great week, everyone. Again, salute our veterans. Hang out a flag out there if you feel so inclined to show your patronage. And Art, I'm going to leave it with you on that.
Okay, well said, Jeff. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for watching and listening to this week's Mortgage Minute. My name again is Art Alvarez at MortgageWorks, where we do have the answers and they're on the house. So long. Take care.